We'll be hearing a conversation facing the fight of its life in the U.S. Supreme Court now, the gold standard of child welfare. We have the delight of having Michele Kriegman. I hope I said that right.
Yep. Michele Kriegman. Yep, you did, Katie.
Who is a pre-ICWA adoptee with Mohawk, Cherokee, and Choctaw, I hope I also said that right, heritage, as well as a former journalist for the ABC News and other television outlets who has served the adoption community. I'm sure by now that you know that you are entitled to receive certificates for your participation, but we will need your name to appear in your Zoom box in the same way that you would like to have it appear on your certificates. As you also know, in our chat box, you'll find a link to the book sale, which gives you the opportunity to not only bring home amazing books on adoption, foster care, and kinship, but also the opportunity to bring home a terrific summer read. And you'll also find the evaluation form, because we always want to know how we do. And at this moment, I'll let you know that we have everyone on mute, unless, of course, our presenter would like you to come off mute for some point. And I'd love to turn it over to our presenter. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you. Thank you for that lovely introduction. I wanted to kind of, that was a great introduction, but I need to kind of also introduce myself another way to kind of tell you a little bit about me. The one thing you left out, and that's because I didn't give it to you and it occurred to me I should have, is if anyone's not actually looking at the video, I'm also white. And that's important, because what's going on is one of the best child welfare laws on the planet is being attacked for being racist against white people. So I am here not only as an adoptee and an adoptive stepmom with Native American roots, I'm also here as a white person who has benefited from the Indian Child Welfare Act. And I was so excited that Dr. McDaniel this morning, our keynote, even gave a shout out to the Indian Child Welfare Act, because it's bigger than just the population of Native children that it serves directly. This was a law, and I'll get into more detail with pictures without getting too wonky. This is a law that was like the shot heard around the world. It influenced Hague conventions on the rights of the child. It's been something that did first from tribal creativity, a lot of the things we're looking at now, like co-parenting between foster parents and birth parents, kinship adoption, the culture, as Dr. McDaniel called it, of a kinship first culture. All of that started incredibly early in 1978, and it's been a collaboration between state and county social workers and clinicians and other government workers, and 486 tribal nations. So like, this is a case of it's working. But I want to tell you, because Claudia and I guess it's Shameen are forcing me to, I do not like to tell my story. And they said, you got to do it. You've got to do it. And my story is sort of like the real story that happened because I was born before the Indian Child Welfare Act. And then there's the imaginary story of what could and maybe legally should have been had I been born after the Indian Child Welfare Act. And I promise there's pictures later. I grew up in a closed adoption. I was told that nothing was known about my birth father. My birth mother had the same ethnicity as my adoptive dad. And that's really kind of what I knew. I remember as a kid, there was a crack from my wonderful alcoholic uncle about I must have been a one-night stand if they didn't know anything about my birth father. And no one in the family could ever quite react to him. We didn't have Al-Anon, so we just kind of rolled with whatever came out of his behavior and mouth. And many years in the future, when I learned the real story, my adoptive mom said, I always knew it was a summer romance. Like that obviously was something that mattered. whether this was an unknown strange guy or something that came from a relationship. And I did come from a relationship. Let's see, I had a good middle class life. I went to college. In my adoptive family, that kind of made me stand out from my adopted sister and cousins who did not. And so in that sense, I kind of felt like, the ugly duckling that doesn't match the rest of the swan family or the rest of the duckling family. But fast forward, when I was about 25, my adoptive mother, who was terrific, and I have pictures of her, and she was a hoot, was diagnosed with the cancer that by the time I was in my mid-30s had taken her away from us. And so by the time I was in my 30s, I had no mother. My father had quickly remarried someone that wanted him to cut ties with his kids and grandkids, and he astonishingly did. So by the time I was in my 30s, I was on my own, and I was fine. I had friends, I had neighbors, I had a job, but it was probably not what anyone planned for me. What I did do before then at one point was decide when I was pregnant to go and try and find my non-identifying information. And I went to my agency, Spence Chapin, and this is kind of an interesting story how human institutions evolve and get better over time. I'm a little bit woo-woo, and I like to believe that we're all evolving towards being a better race of people and a better planet, and Spence Chapin did the right thing. I was born before 1978, and they did what they thought was the right thing then, which was if you could possibly erase someone's Native American heritage, you did. You whitewashed them, and I was whitewashed. They had details about my birth parents' relationship. They knew that he was Native American, and what they told my parents, they said when I went back as an adult, and I believed them, was that they did not share this with my parents. They said, however, pursuant to the of 1978, which I'd never heard of before, we now are obliged to share every piece of information we have, and you do have the right to get your records. You can probably get your original birth certificate. I told my adoptive father this. He said, oh, I'll do it. And then he told me, despite this law, which is ICWA, the Indian Child Welfare Act, it's a bit of a mouthful, but it's important. He told me that despite this, he wasn't able to get it. I found out after his death that he was not speaking truthfully. He never actually petitioned the court. And because I thought he was telling me the truth and that he did, I also didn't petition the court because I thought he had tried and failed. So one shock was to find out that I'd had a heritage all along. And, that comes back to you. It comes back to you in remembering, drunken Uncle Mel, but it also comes back to you when you're about to speak at AFFCNY says, do you realize you're not in this deck? You have all this legal stuff and you are not in this deck. And I'm very used to just sort of living without a backstory. And I'm trying to put my backstory here. And it's probably kind of the first time I've shared my birth father's side. The other piece of it was that, so one surprise was that heritage. The other surprise was that someone had been trying to reach me from my birth family. And it would turn out it was my birth mother. And she really didn't want me to know anything more about my birth father. I got his name, thank you to the Indian Child Welfare Act, from Spence Chapin. She would not share it with me, but it was in their files and they did share it with me. And that was the right thing to do. What happened, she lives overseas. We do have an attachment or a relationship. But I was pregnant, I wasn't gonna fly. She said she was gonna come over and then didn't. And for the next 3 years, she planned and canceled trips. And finally, I decided I needed to go in a different direction. And I began to look for my birth father. And and it was really disappointing. I'm brushing over those 3 years, but there were ups and downs for me, for my kids, my birth mother's grandkids, her only grandkids, where she promised things like a visit on my birthday or sending my oldest daughter a birthday present and then let that kind of thing go. So finally, I decided I would try searching. And I live in New Jersey, and I think half of the adoption world on the East Coast knows Pam Hasagawa. And she is a neighbor here. And she and about a total of 17 people who are not Indigenous had tried to have their records unsealed in local family court and failed. But the attorney that advised them was the same guy, Bert Hirsch, who was the drafter of the Indian Child Welfare Act. So they put me in touch with Bert, and he put me in touch with an oral historian of the Mohawk tribe at the St. Regis Reservation in upstate New York. And I wish I was able to go back recently in 2022 and thank him and give him updates. I've lost her name and I haven't been able to do that with her. But she really tried and wasn't able to find my birth father. But every step of the way of my search, I'd always hear, oh, there was a woman from the reservation who actually called with the same questions. So she certainly gave it her best shot. And like, I wish I could send a thank you out to the universe for her taking on my cause like that. But she was not able to find my birth father. Finally, with a detective and the information I got from Spence because of the Indian Child Welfare Act, we were able to locate him. And I learned very quickly why my birth mother was uncomfortable with me meeting him. And that was because he had wanted to keep me. He was about to get married, and the person he married worked with children. She was a professor at Bank Street College her entire career. And they had both decided they wanted to raise me. And my birth mother later confirmed his story. He said, you know, we said we wanted to raise you, but we were staying together. We were already engaged. I was the result of an affair while she was on sabbatical. And well, his wife, now widow, was on sabbatical. And my birth mother said, if you're not going to marry me, I'm going to put it up for adoption. And she put it up for adoption. So, you know, I look at what my life was with the Indian Child Welfare Act and without it, and what it could be for other adoptees and other foster kids. And working with tribal governments, we already have a lot of the very cutting edge things that Sixto Cancel was talking about yesterday, or Dr. McDaniels talked about this morning for the larger population. That's already happening because of the culture created by the Indian Child Welfare Act. And I'm going to get into the 5 principles of it in just a minute. So, but kind of to wrap up my story, I sort of have these 2 images, you know. With the Indian Child Welfare Act, I was not a candidate for adoption. I was wanted by my biological parent and his partner. They were well able, psychologically, financially, to raise me. And I would have grown up with siblings that went to college, first cousins that were like me. And in my 30s, I would have still had a family. I would have even had grandparents. And that's not the case with how it played out, because I was born, I'm dating myself, before 1978, before passage of the Indian Child Welfare Act. And yeah, sometimes I think about that and some of the details, and that can really sink me down. I want this law for other kids. It's a good law. It's a very good law. But now I'm going to kind of take it up a level and give you some numbers to make this more than my story. So I'm going to share the screen. It'll take me a minute. Here we go. I hope that this is the way to do it, so that is everyone seeing both my presentation and each other if they want?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, super. Okay, what I'm going to do is minimize that because I don't want to see myself. on the wrong slide. So, I'm so nervous. And just to give you a sense of why I'm nervous, this law could go away in 7 weeks because it's being challenged. It is part of the culture wars now. And the next like 3 slides will go into that. But just to give you a picture of what it was like before 1978, we know that there's been a lot of transracial adoption at its peak. Something like 1 in 100 children born in Guatemala were sent overseas for adoption. At its peak in 1985, 1.3 of every live births in South Korea were babies then placed for adoption. And those are historic numbers. But what I want to share with you, and it may be a little bit overdone in red, is that the number for Indigenous children was not 1 or 1.3. It was 24 to 35 children out of every 100 that were placed in foster care or adoption. And this is long-term foster care. And of the ones that were placed in adoptive families, 90% were placed with non-Indigenous families. These numbers are for tribal citizens. I want to take a step back. About 10% of the United States since the census of 1990, and I worked in Japanese television. We actually did a big story about the census of 1990 and how suddenly 10% of America was Native American. And that has a lot of facets to it. But so that affects the hiding and the whitewashing affects all 10% when it comes to adoption. The some other details of the act may only impact the 2% that are tribal citizens. So for example, you can, upon age 18 with some tribes, start receiving a stipend from the federal government or from the tribal government. That's not something that I'm eligible for or that I seek. But that is something that is also available to some of our kids if it can be proven that they are tribal citizens or if they can enroll as tribal citizens. But for the other 80%, oh, my math is off, for the other 90% of adoptees with Indigenous heritage, it plays out more in terms of having information and having connections and not living in this strange fog of, I don't know half my heritage. So how did we get to this place where almost a third of Native American kids are up for adoption? And if you've been following the news, you've heard of residential schools. They started in the late 19th century, most shut down by the early 1960s, although I am told there's still 4 in operation, but with very narrow focus in terms of residents. And then after that, in the 50s up through 1967, there was something called the Indian Adoption Projects. It was federally funded to encourage adoption of reservation children. But those programs pretty much ended by the mid-60s. And yet we still have these numbers. There were no policies to separate Native American families, but the culture was created by earlier policies where we really weren't respecting Native American families. We weren't trying to keep them together. And there even was a certain high-handedness. And this is a story I got earlier this year from Bert Hirsch, who had helped me all those years ago, and who was the primary drafter, along with 2 legislative aides, of the Indian Child Welfare Act. And he tells this story. He wants to emphasize, we didn't set out to make a law. He was a young idealistic attorney working for the American Indian Affairs, I'm sorry, for the Association of American Indian Affairs. And he was called out to South Dakota by the Spirit Lake tribe. And what had happened was there was a grandmother there who was not accused of abuse or neglect, who was raising her grandchild when social workers came in and very high-handedly took the child away. And they had a waiting white couple who were looking for a child, and the adoption was expedited and done. And he describes it like a crime scene. You know, sometimes you go, if you watch a crime procedural show, they'll say, oh, this guy has, you know, he's sloppy. This is the first time he's done this. Or, wow, we've got ourselves a serial killer. He knows what he's doing. And Bert described it as the latter. They knew what they were doing. They came in, they took the child, they had the, you know, the family court judge ready. They had the family, you know, this was not the first time they'd done this. So he got curious and he worked with what was then a really weak tribal government. It was really at that point 11 years before passage. So it was the late 1960s. And he worked with it before, and then as you know, 60s and 70s was really the strengthening of tribal governments, and it saw the American Indian movement, AIM, and really at the same time, he was trying to work with what were still weaker governments then. But at Spirit Lake, they put together a survey where they tried to find out just how often is this happening, because this looks like these social workers had done this before. And what they found was that about 24 out of every 100 children had been separated from their family, and no one knew about it. And every family thought they were alone in this. It was a rural area. This is not something you brag about. And so the extent of this was just not known. And there wasn't anything particular, as Bert was talking with the elders about the Spirit Lake tribe. They didn't have higher rates of any kind of social issues. So they started a massive nationwide effort coordinating with over 400 tribal nations to administer the same survey there. And they pretty much got the same results, anywhere from 24 out of 100 children to 33 out of 100 children were taken, usually for adoption, sometimes for foster care, but usually for adoption. 90% of the time, they did not go to Indigenous homes. And it almost feels like the bad old days, where people who ran residential schools still controlled the culture, where you were sort of saying, kill the Indians, save the man, get them out of this bad situation. And in some situations, maybe in many situations, for the child's safety, you had to do that. But there was no priority. In fact, there seemed in some cases to be a deprioritization of placing them with kin, or placing them even within the same tribe. And so that's really best. I want to go to the next slide. And they realized it didn't need to be this way. And after this 11-year battle of doing the coordinating around the country and fighting in the legislature, we did have passage of the Indian Child Welfare Act. Ironically, Barry Goldwater, who was then considered the right wing of the Republican Party, was one of its supporters. And today the Goldwater Institute is one of its attackers. And I'll get into that on the next slide. But I want you to take away, but if you're a professional, may already sound very familiar, but it started in 1978. And that's the 5 child welfare principles of the Indian Child Welfare Act. So one is that the best interests of the child prioritize remaining in the family of origin, absent abuse or neglect. There was no abuse or neglect in any view of my birth father. There was no abuse or neglect given as a reason for separating the grandchild from her grandmother in South Dakota that started this movement. What the right wing is now saying is that, that this law adds bureaucracy, or it adds red tape, or it adds too many regulations, by requiring that an expert testify there's actually been neglect or abuse, that you can't just walk into someone's home and take their child without a good cause. The second principle is that the ICWA does not make safety determinations. On the right, it said, well, we have to do this, the Indian Child Welfare Act endangers children. It doesn't. If a child is in danger, you get them out of that situation. Where the Indian Child Welfare Act comes into play is how you determine placement after that. It doesn't make a child sit in a bad situation longer. The third principle of the Indian Child Welfare Act is what Dr. McDaniels called sort of the kinship first. And the way the ICWA, and I'm simplifying a lot, and I'm not an attorney, is that first, if the parents aren't there, you go to extended traditional families, such as the spirit-like grandmother. Then you go to tribal members, and then after that, and this is where the racism argument comes in, then you go to other Indigenous people. And I'll talk about race soon. The reason for going to other Indigenous people is very often you will have multiple tribes in the same geographic area. So to go to other Indigenous families means you're keeping the child near where relatives might be, near where their, original traditional home might have been. But also there's the experience of being Indigenous and of being relocated. And there are shared cultures, cultural points between different tribes. Some tribes speak different languages, but they're the same language family. So there's many good reasons for also prioritizing prospective Indigenous adoptive parents over non-Indigenous adoptive parents. Then the fourth point, which is in yellow here, is that Indigenous is defined by tribal membership, and it's not defined by race. The very first person I met who could talk to me about Cherokee culture, it presented as African American. If you saw her, you'd say, oh, she's Black, which is also true. And I'm white, which is also true. But she and I were both Cherokee. And that's why this law really can't be, or this point is one of the two reasons this law is not about racism against white people. It benefits Black Indigenous people, it benefits white Indigenous people, because we are such a mix. But also, there really isn't a race. What this is about is respecting tribal sovereignty and the rights of a tribe to take care of their children once a determination has been made that they need to be moved somewhere safer. It's not about forcing kids to stay in danger or in neglect. It's about setting up creative arrangements like kinship care or kinship gap care or co-parenting with foster parents, many, many different kinds of families, but letting it happen through the tribe and not through the traditional closed adoption with a white couple. And then finally, the fifth principle, child welfare principle, the ICWA, it allows us, whether we came from a reservation, I didn't, or whether we just have Native American heritage, we have a right to know our heritage. And that is, these 5 principles are ones that my old adoption agency, Spence Chapin, follows now. We get better. When we know better, we do better. So why, if we know that these are good principles, why, if we have so many people citing these principles throughout this conference, is it even possible to attack it? And that leads us to our next slide. And I call it, let's take a look at the Indian child welfare actors. The court case is called Halen v. Bracking, but I'm just going to call it the ICWA case for short. So and a little bit of background. This was in the 5th Circuit in Texas. There was an evangelical couple. They had already adopted, foster care to adopt. They were, from all reports, good parents. And there was another, and they already had a Navajo Cherokee child. Another one had to be removed from their situation, and they offered to foster this child, and they wanted to adopt this child. What happened was the Navajo Nation thought that they might have prospective parents who were Navajo, and they wanted to place that child from that temporary foster care assignment with this Navajo couple. That fell through. And so, and this is part of the court papers, the Cherokee Nation and the Navajo Nation, who both had a say, and Cherokee Nation did not have an alternative. They both gave the couple permission to proceed with the adoption. The adoption was finalized in 4 months. So that's pretty good timing. Yet they're saying, well, the ICWA created all these obstacles and it's racist against white people. And what happened was, even though the adoption was finalized in 4 months, even though it was done through the ICWA with the approval of tribal nations, we have a whole lineup here where the opponents of the ICWA are a law firm with 20 international branches around the world, known for representing big oil in Texas. Another party is Texas. And then finally, the Goldwater Institute is also involved. Supporters of the ICWA are former allies of that Goldwater Institute. One legislator said, if Barry Goldwater were alive today, he'd be rolling over in his grave, because this is using children as pawns. We have 486 tribal nations supporting the ICWA. We have 59 Native organizations, 11 child welfare organizations, and then more than half of the states of the United States support this. So what's going on? The theory is that by undermining tribal authority in children, in control of how their children are placed, it's one more cut at tribal authority. And the more cuts at tribal authority over children, over land, over oil, over mineral rights, the easier it is for big oil and other multinationals to come in and really ride roughshod over land that is not theirs to ride roughshod over. We saw that with the oil pipeline going over Dakota Holy Lands, which, by the way, kind of fell out of the news cycle. The Supreme Court did the right thing and they reversed that, and the pipeline is now not continuing over tribal lands in the Dakotas. But the same people that were doing that are now suddenly interested in child welfare law, and it's scary. So, and there's going to be time for us to do questions and answers at the end, but I do want to give you a lot of information, and we can go back if you want to. So my theory, and I am not an attorney, is this is much more about weakening tribal sovereignty than addressing a real problem in child welfare. In fact, for me, it solved a problem in child welfare. And kind of, so here's the pop quiz. And this is the first of two that we're going to have in this presentation. This is, if you want to put your answers in the chat, that would be great. And I'll read the questions and give you a minute. And then we're going to do that at the end. We had talked about 3 takeaways for working with kids and helping kids who've been impacted, who have Native background. That comes later. But with this is sort of the end of the legal portion of this, but I want you to know this. So the first question is, will children be left in dangerous situations until an Indigenous family or tribal member can take them in? And maybe if you put 1 and then your answer, if you want to do this. 2, did the ICWA create new regulations to impede adoptions, thus harming children? Three, this is kind of a leading question. Doesn't prioritizing Indigenous prospective parents of another tribe over other prospective parents show racism? Four, if only 2% of the US are tribal citizens, why do I care? Okay, and I kind of gave you this before. Hint, 10% of the US have tribal heritage. 5, post-adoption. How has the ICWA affected pre-ICWA adult adoptees like me? 6, is the rate of Indigenous children being placed in foster care or placed for adoption the same as that of other identified groups? And this is a tough one. On the slide this morning, for New York, less than 1% of the population for New York is Native American, and less than 1% are in foster care. In general, across reservations, which is the easiest place to actually get numbers, then the number or the ratio of Native American kids in foster care and placed for adoption, for permanent adoption, is slightly higher than the general population. And then 7, ethically, if you've enjoyed white privilege, and this is me, white privilege, should you still check American Indian or Alaska Native on application forms? And there's no right answer. This should be a nuanced conversation. And these are all leading questions. You've got what I think are the right answers for most of them up until now, but we're going to kind of address them again in a different way when we talk more about what has happened in 2022. Okay, ta-da, here we go. So, bear with me just a second. Okay. I'm going to go back to my story, this time illustrated. My birth mother, while insisting she didn't know my birth father's name, etc., did draw me a picture. This is years ago, and it was me where she drew his features or emphasized his features in my picture. I was able to meet him. This is us at a brunch in New York City in the center picture. And like after that, I was someone that never thought about adoption, never wanted to meet birth family. Some people call that being in the fog. I call it just focusing on other things. But at that time, I kind of exploded, and I was doing research, and I was writing for childbirth magazines about when adoptees give birth. We've been told our mother died in childbirth. We'll find out what story we've been told, that kind of thing. I wrote about maternity homes. I wrote about what should be ethics in adoption. And it was something that editors were interested in because it was such a narrow narrative. Oh, we took the poor child and put them with a happy family and gave them a fresh start. And that's actually the term that I ran into a lot, where people were saying, oh, we gave you a fresh start. And don't assume that, don't assume that the past, the alternate reality, me being raised with my biological father, would have been so terrible. It wouldn't have been. But my way of processing was just to write and to say there really is a concept of ethics in adoptions. The ends don't justify the means. And that actually is still a very live issue internationally. I've done a different presentation on trafficking, and very often it's hard to get countries to buy into the concept that if human trafficking ends in adoption or marriage, it's bad, because marriage and babies are good, right? So the ends justify the means, and that's still a battle happening in the United Nations. Here's what I learned from this, and this is what I promised even before things happened with the Supreme Court this session, was to get into these 3 points with you. And oh, let me back up. One thing I didn't say. So I've mentioned Bert Hirsch, the author of the Indian Child Welfare Act. I've mentioned that he helped me way back when, as did a woman who was an oral historian at the St. Regis Reservation. And I wanted to update him because I'd done a DNA test and I had more information and I wanted to thank him. And I reached out to him in January and we spoke on the phone a little bit. And that was kind of it. He's in his 80s, he's retired. And suddenly, I guess the morning of Monday, February 28th, he said, it's a go, meaning that the Supreme Court is really actually hearing a challenge to his life's work, the Indian Child Welfare Act. Because he spent his life, after drafting this, fighting to get Indian adoptees access to their records, to fight for family reunification when a child was wrongfully separated. This was his life's work, and he's saying, and they really are hearing it. The Supreme Court has changed enough in its composition that they are really taking on something that has succeeded for over 40 years, and it may get struck down. They are supposed to hand down a decision by June, the end of June. That's when this session ends. The next session begins in October. And the reason I really want you to know this is it could be that the Indian Child Welfare Act goes away. It could be that someone decides, let's see, we've got, this European white family, let's just tell them this child is the same. That's what my parents were told. I was told I was sort of something Western European, and that was not true. We as social workers, we as clinicians, we as parents can do better than whatever the law says. We can do those 5 principles of the Indian Child Welfare Act about telling our kids the truth, by not stealing the truth from them, whatever the Supreme Court decides. And that's why it may be very important. If this is struck down as a national law, it might be an opportunity for activism personally. If you're a case manager, it might be an opportunity for activism at the county level in social services or at the state level in social services in the interest of child welfare. So, and that's where this ties, where all the legal stuff in the Supreme Court ties to what we do every day. So first, be able to recognize and shield your children, whether you're a parent or a professional, from echoes of past discriminatory policies, like the mindless separation of children and the mindless whitewashing of our heritage. And I'll have more picture examples later. And also be able to identify in ourselves parallel losses and blind spots. And this is where my adoptive mom totally rocked. And she said, I realized that because I was so uncomfortable talking about infertility, she'd had a hysterectomy when she was in her 20s, that it probably just felt like we couldn't talk about any of this. And my mom was right. I was a loyal daughter. I didn't bring up anything about heritage. In conversation, we were able to kind of say there's a parallel loss, losing heritage and losing a connection to biological descendants. You can have descendants of the heart, you can have ancestors of the heart, but there's also ancestors and descendants by blood that we both lost. And the more as parents and professionals we can tap into what we've lost, the easier it's going to be for our kids and our clients to be open with us and around us about their losses too. And then the third takeaway I got from this experience, and that I think can be helpful for you, is that learn the questions that help us find a balance between connection and independence. And what I mean by that is I was really good at reading tea leaves and knowing, okay, this person's really uncomfortable with the thought of their kid searching, and I just wouldn't discuss it around them. It doesn't mean I had no opinion or it didn't matter to me. It just meant they were not the person who was ready to hear it now. And your kids can be just as smart and intuitive that way too. So sometimes you have to, however you feel inside, learn to ask some of those open-ended questions. Would you like to learn more about your heritage? This is going on, this powwow is happening. We can go to it. Would you like to go? There's questions that we as the adults or the parents or the professionals can ask that give permission. And there's so many ways that it feels like permission has been taken away by policy in some cases, by culture in others, to ask about our heritage, especially if it's a minority heritage, such as Native Americans. Oh yeah. I made a point before about I'm not here to try and get a stipend from various tribes. I probably would have a hard fight getting legal tribal membership. That doesn't change for a minute that I do have Mohawk and Choctaw and Cherokee heritage. What I can do and what I want to enable you to do at the end, there's a slide with links for donating, is that I can donate. I know that this is a good law. There's a Supreme Court project that's a network of 200 lawyers around the country that specialize in Indian law who are working to support the Indian Child Welfare Act. We can donate to that, and I'll get to that with the list of links at the end of this talk. We can attend conversations, and thank you for being here, about what this means. If you have small children, and if you're in a part of the country where there are Native Americans, I'm totally okay with, I want to befriend this person because they're Native American, and my kid is too. I don't need it to be an organic friendship. You can have friendships with a mission. I think that's absolutely acceptable as a parent. Other things, Secretary of the Interior Haaland has said, let's not use the S word, SQUAW, because of its derogatory and sexual overtones. So let's not use the S word. You know, if your kid goes, wow, this is really cool, here in Montville, New Jersey, there's all these streets with Lenni Lenape names, and there's not a single Lenape living here. Most of them are in Oklahoma. It's okay, don't rush in to make your kid feel happy. Let them pause for a moment. This was part of my processing, to notice these street names I grew up around that are with Lenni Lenape Indians that are completely empty of Lenni Lenape people. And this ties right into number 3, is let me revisit things. It's not wallowing. It's not about you or us. Again, open questions and not leading ones are the most helpful. Let me revisit. It's part of processing. It doesn't need to be forever, but it doesn't need to be rushed. Number 4, you know, I can't say we Choctaw. I can't say we Mohawk. I just can't say we Cherokee. I am freaking out seeing pictures of my family on a PowerPoint as I'm talking to you, because one of my biological family, when I'm talking to you, because they feel like they still, or they did for many years, not we. And that's partly because we didn't grow up in the culture, but then part of it is number 5, we often encounter secondary rejections. My relationship with my birth father was complicated. And I actually wrote a memoir/novel about it because it was so interesting. It should have been a great reunion. He knew Betty Jean Lifton. He read all her books. He read Memoir of an Adopted Daughter. He was the director of fiscal services for foster care and special needs adoptions in New York City. And he and I met face to face once. And there's a whole story behind that. So secondary rejection often comes with reunion. With tribal people, there's all sorts of what I think is craziness about blood quantum levels and are you Indian enough or not Indian enough? And that can feel like rejection. And boy, that's when we need our adoptive family as our foundation, or that's when we need our foster family to help be our rock, or however, and that's however we define family. You know, one of the beautiful things about the Indian Child Welfare Act was the first piece of law that didn't define family. It let people on the ground working with children define family. And that is huge. Our adoptive family is our family, and sometimes they have to stay our foundation, even through trying to reconnect with birth family like this because of secondary rejection, which is which makes number 6 obvious. Regardless of tribal citizenship, some losses are for keeps. For me, I lost being Mohawk. I lost being Cherokee. I lost, being Choctaw. But keep showing up if you're in that child's life or that adoptee or foster care alum's life, because you are also our family. And if you're there for us, it makes a world of difference. So these are things that worked. And they might, if you're working with Native American kids, be something that works. And a few things that didn't. So for me, connecting with nature, knowing that this is Lenni Lenape land and that it was developed by Mohawk iron workers, who are some of my ancestors. That's sort of a wonderful coming together. Knowing that Native American thinking is part of our legal intellectual history, because if you hadn't guessed, I like the law. And so the idea of women inheriting property and the idea of women inheriting money or having the vote was something that was part of the Iroquois Confederacy in Canada and upstate New York, where Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony lived. And they looked around them and they saw what could be for women and were inspired. And so a lot of their work came directly from the Iroquois Confederacy, and that the Iroquois' treatment of women and the equality women had within the government there is part of our heritage as Americans, really. Some of this is goofy. I mean, a big part of it is we are a lacrosse family. It's raining today. We have no game, but lacrosse was an Iroquois and in the South, a Cherokee game. 4, again, kind of like, for me, it was being authentic, letting me see the street names and go, wow, this is not really connecting me to anything. Like, as you can see in the picture, Dead Indian Memorial Road, like it doesn't resonate for me. My first and only powwow I went to here in New Jersey, everyone had dyed black hair and they were selling turquoise. You can't find turquoise in the Northeast. And I was just like, nah, this isn't doing it for me. And what really hit me when I was going through that a couple of years ago is what I gained from this was loss. And that's good, because instead of being in this fog of, I don't know half my heritage and I don't care, I was going, oh, I know some of my heritage. Realistically, I can't reconnect to it. And I've lost it and I can grieve it. But the cool thing about not being in a fog and being able to grieve is I can also laugh more easily, and I can feel joy more easily, and I can feel gratitude and appreciate what I do have more easily if I'm allowed to also realize what I've lost. I mean, some losses are for keeps. Some losses are for keeps. And then I wrote. I love fiction. A lot of my birth family are writers, so I guess I come by it naturally. And I wrote about a lot of this and how things went with my birth father over the years, for example. Now, here's the good stuff. Here's the good stuff. This was 2022. This is where, to some extent, I went from thinking of my Indigenous ancestors and family as them to we. And that's a really good feeling. My husband says I seem more centered, and I think he's right. So on the left, at one point, I kind of decided I need to move on from this generation of my birth parents. And my relationships now are with my brother, who's a writer in New York City, or a journalist rather. And that's the two of us at Bryant Park. And with first cousins who are musicians and writers, and they are my peeps. It also means a lot to me to do DNA tests that confirm things. So for example, on Ancestry DNA, I tie to 10 other family trees that all confirm a story that my brother never heard, but that I heard from my birth father that one time we met, which is that on the one side is Cherokee and Choctaw, his father's side, but on the other side is Mohawk. And my brother had never heard that. So I was kind of confused, and it was a little bit of a fog, but with Ancestry DNA, everybody connects to this Mohawk woman who at her marriage converted to being a Quaker, and we have her adult baptismal record. And that was really validating to see, oh, that really is true, that really happened. So quick tour. I'll go over top right is my grandfather, Tom, my great grandfather, Oscar, and my grandmother, Sally. Tom was Cherokee and Choctaw from Tennessee. He seems to be the only one that left Tennessee and Arkansas and came up to New York City, kind of to get away from a lot of the social ills that he felt were there. There was work here, there was construction going on here. And in fact, there's a whole section for construction workers where he met his future wife, my grandmother, Sally, who was of partial Mohawk descent. And that's an area in Brooklyn. It's now called Burham Hill, I believe. It used to be North Gowanus. There are still Mohawk iron worker connections, like there's a Facebook group, for example, still. So he got away from the Cherokee and Choctaw, but he married into the Mohawk. Bottom right is my birth father. Probably a high school picture, a cousin thinks. I have a cousin who sent all these pictures down in Memphis. The center picture I love with the quilt in the background, that is my great grandmother, Minnie. I had been told by my birth father she was Cherokee. This cousin says, actually, no, it was Choctaw and Cherokee. And then I spoke to a genealogist and said, when he's done searches for people in the Southeast, there's a lot of records of Choctaw applying for Cherokee citizenship and being rejected. I don't have the whole story there. And then the lower left is my birth father and his brothers as little kids at a rally. And that's my grandmother standing above her boys. It's just nice to have that. I've had these pictures for a couple months and it's just peaceful. It's like, oh yeah, I've got ancestors too, just like everybody else. It's nice to have those pictures. And I really brushed over my adoptive mom. I didn't want to do that. So I'll go back here very quickly. Lady with the Beehive, that's Carolyn Kriegman, my adoptive mom. She is amazing. She was an artist. She was someone who was told one thing at the beginning of the adoption process and adjusted to things turning out to be different, just like Spence Chapin adjusted, and we can all grow together. And that's me with the black hair, little kid there. That's me on a swing, probably age 2 or 3. What I'd like to do is show you these. There's 3 links I want to share with you. And maybe we can, what I'll do is I'll do an abridged version of this deck and I'll put it, if I can, in the AFFCNY platform, or maybe we can put this in the chat.
We'd be delighted to take an abridged version and have it into our platform.
Yeah, I'm not sure we need all the family pictures, but I can certainly get you the useful stuff. Helen v. Bracklin is the name of the test case. It was Brackeen versus something else when it was only Texas. It's been worked its way all the way up the appellate system now in the Supreme Court. This is its title. This is the Supreme Court's website. And if you're like a document geek, I am. It's got the briefs, the friend of the court letters, everything is there digitized that you can look at and wade through. The second link, and this is where I think it's a really healthy way to connect, is to donate. Really, the Supreme Court is going to make a decision that's going to set a precedent culturally for adoption and foster care, not just for Native American kids, but I think for kids of any, identifiable minority ethnic group, because there is the priority that's placed on being with family or being within your own ethnic group where possible. And if that goes away, that impacts everybody. And this is the Supreme Court project of the Native American Legal Fund. It's 200 attorneys strong. A lot of them are working pro bono. They are working crazy hours now because it's a go. And they've been working crazy hours since February 28th, when the Supreme Court surprised everyone and said, yep, we're going to hear the rights attack on this child welfare law. And then finally, another third link, and this is probably the easiest one to read if you're not into legal stuff, to just keep on top of what's going online, is the National Indian Child Welfare Association. They do periodically have press releases about developments in multiple legal cases around child welfare. So these 3 links are good ones to check out, and then find the one that suits you. The second 2 do take donations. I've donated to both of them, the National Indian Child Welfare Association and to the Supreme Court project, because I think they're good people, they do good work, and they need us now. And we're going to get an answer, good or bad, at the end of June. And at the end of June is when I hope that the other part of this presentation, where I talk about how you work with children or clients that have been taken from their culture, and or found out newly, as I did as an adult, that I had a culture, how we can work with them. And then I'm on social media and you can find me. And if you really want to geek out, I love this stuff. Not everybody does. This is my anti-trafficking treaties. So starting with the Declaration of Human Rights to 1948 till the Hague Conference, that in 2013 finally adopted something that the Indian child welfare pioneered in 1978, which was the idea that all things being equal, a child is better off with their family of origin. It took us that long to go from this law to really accepting that idea worldwide. And just to give you an idea of how ahead of its time in some ways this law was, and why it's important that we preserve it. And then, surprise, surprise, I've been working on this memoirish novel, and I took that picture that my birth mother drew of me when I was much younger, where she tried to add details that emphasized my birth father in it. And that's kind of where we're at. So I would love to hear your reactions or your experiences if you've worked with the ICWA. I'm going to stop sharing now, if that's okay. Yeah, because I'd like to hear from you. I am not good at following chat while presenting, so I didn't actually look at people's answers.
Phenomenal presentation, Michele.
Thanks,
Is Marcy talking? Really good, and really good points.
Thank you.
Thanks for connecting the legal and the personal, because of course, laws are all about people. And these laws affect people's lives. That's the whole point. So really appreciate you sharing your personal experiences. I know that's hard.
Yeah, I had a moment last night where I was looking at the PowerPoints and I'm going, oh my God, I'm going to be talking to strangers about my life. This is not what I do. So thank you. Thanks, Marcy.
Michele, thank you so much.
Thanks, Pam.
Thank you for inviting me here. It's been such an honor to participate and to hear what you have to say today. I knew a little bit about your story because you'd shared with me, but this was wonderful, and the homework that you've put into this, it's going to help social workers like me to come into my own community and do what I need to do here.
Good.
Like
That's what I want to hear.
You've given me a foundation to start with, where I don't have to start from scratch and I really appreciate that. And thank you so much for sharing everything that you
you.
did.
Thank you.
It's beautiful.
Michelle, on behalf of AFFCNY, I wanted to thank you for your presentation. It was certainly a delight to be here. And thank you so much for sharing so much of yourself. Just to take care of a couple of housekeeping little things, I just wanted to remind everyone that if you're going to need training certificates, there is a link in the chat to it. Also, we have our survey. We just want to know what you thought of the conference in general, and also our book table where we can increase our knowledge base on things related to adoption, guardianship, and foster care, but also find a great summer read and benefit AFFCNY as well. Thank you again for being here, and I'm so glad that so many of us were here to have this learning experience.
Thank you for having me. It was good to be able to talk about this because we didn't expect that the Supreme Court would hear this, that they would take the challenge seriously, and B, that they would hear it so soon. So we've got 7 weeks left.
So, Michele, thank you so much for all that you've shared and the links, and I'll definitely be following you more closely and around all of this, but the Supreme Court's issues, of course. And thanks for the links to donate. Are there other actions that we can take around the Supreme Court case?
At this point, you can reach out to the Native American Legal Fund. There's a possibility, and I'm not at all officially on this case in any way, shape, or form, but if your organization wants to submit a friend of the court brief, that can only help. Not just for this case, but for cases going forward, because there are many different ways that tribal sovereignty gets attacked, especially around children. And what the Native American Legal Fund has done is they've set up a network for writing briefs. So they know go-to organizations. If you can get your organization in that network, if that's appropriate, so that if there's another particular case involving a group of children or a law that affects children, that they know that they can go to you not only this time, but in the future to write a friend of the court brief. That's probably because I know you're with an organization. I'm just an individual, so that's not something I can do, but
I'm just an individual too, but I am connected to organizations. So
okay.
I would definitely want to share it with them to, yeah, okay.
Okay.
Susan, you have enough credentials after your name anyway and experience that if you wrote an Atticus brief, the court, it would be
credentials. My credentials are in IT. I'm just a corporate tech geek. That doesn't count for nothing. But
well, you got to make fake ones like after your name because that's what I do.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
I just make them up and they're my own.
Okay, and they're on tape now. It's sort of
well, I'm not saying them out loud because they're not safe for work words.
They're like neo pronouns, except they're neo credentials. Okay.
Exactly. They might have, might be creative, but it's fun.
Okay. So I'm gonna go there. I'm gonna say it. Even though this law is about American Indian children, it can apply to so many things around kinship. And that's why I want everyone to know about this. I believe, and a lot of people believe, and it's going to be argued in papers before the Supreme Court, that this is really a backdoor to weakening tribal sovereignty. But it's also a backdoor if you want to undo some of the good work, say, of a Sixto Cancel or a Dr. McDaniels around kinship placement. This is another way to create a culture that makes it much harder for them to do what they're doing. And so you don't have to be Cherokee or Choctaw or Navajo or any of that for this to possibly affect your kids.